But we have to largely look at these on two ends of the spectrum, right? You have high carb, low fat. Over here, you have very low carb, high fat. They both seem to produce some pretty powerful health benefits. The second you start mixing both of them at high levels in this Western diet, I mean, that is what a Western diet is. It doesn't go well, almost ever.
All right. So Andrew Koutnik, you are a researcher at Sanson Diabetes Research Institute.
Yep.
So you study nutrition, you study diabetes, you study metabolic health all day, every day. Tell me, what is going on? Why is it that people that typically have insulin resistance are overweight?
Yeah, that story is quite interesting. I don't think it's as straightforward as a lot of people assume. We know that people with type 2 diabetes tend to be overweight and or obese, and that body elevation and adipose tissue or fat tissue can be strongly linked to insulin resistance. And so that's a lot of where that story comes from. But we also know that there are many scenarios where someone isn't obese and can also develop insulin resistance in the context of something like type 1 diabetes. And so it's a very complex story, but we know that increased adiposity, being obese, is a strong predictor of developing type 2 diabetes, largely through this well-known phenomenon, most characteristic of something like type 2 diabetes, which is insulin resistance. So we know that fat tissue can lead to insulin resistance. It is tightly coupled, but it's not always the case where someone has to be obese and they develop insulin resistance.
So is it not real cut and dry on which came first, the chicken or the egg?
I think that there's strong evidence, very strong evidence, that as people become more and more overweight and or obese, that they develop higher and higher insulin resistance. That is very tightly coupled, but there's all these other factors. So exercise is a very strong factor in that, where someone can, exercise and we see these robust elevations and insulin sensitivity or a reduction in insulin resistance immediately post-exercise that can linger for hours, maybe even a day or days in some scenarios. So there are other factors that play into why someone may or may not be insulin resistant that is not always related to how much fat tissue someone has on their total body composition. But body composition is absolutely predictive in most data for someone developing insulin resistance.
What is happening, even surface level, mechanistically, sort of just a basic 500-foot aerial view of someone that is like how adipose tissue or just adiposity in general is affecting insulin resistance? Like what's happening top down there?
I think one of the big themes that comes up a lot of times in this discussion is of course, like subtle inflammation. So as someone develops more and more adipose tissue, there can be signs of subtle but elevated levels of inflammation in the body. We know that inflammation can ultimately facilitate insulin resistance. There's data in a lot of studies, albeit preclinical models or in vitro models where people are looking at cells or animal models where they can pull tissue and manipulate experimentally what's going on and see that many inflammatory biomolecules actually can block the signaling pathway of insulin actually getting to the insulin receptor and ultimately facilitating a glucose uptake effect. So that's ultimately what we're talking about insulin sensitivity, right? Is when insulin molecule gets to the receptor and ultimately facilitates this glucose uptake into tissue. The biggest tissue we have that's kind of this glucose sink is obviously muscle. So a lot of times when we speak about insulin resistance, we're often talking about insulin resistance of the muscle tissue predominantly, although there's obviously other tissues of high relevance in insulin resistance or in insulin in general, like the hepatic tissue as well, where outside of context of type 1 diabetes, which is its own unique physiology, which we can learn a lot from, where you can actually have insulin initially when it's released. And to back up for a second, to tell people the full story of what's going on. So let's say you go and eat food, right? So let's say you went to, it's getting close to lunchtime, you have lunch. That lunch has the typical breakdown of a mixed meal for the average American. Let's say 45 to 50% of that's carbohydrates. Anywhere from 15 to 25% of that might be protein, and then about a similar ratio for fat. And depending on how you make up that total caloric composition, someone eats that food, those carbohydrates, that fat, that protein gets into the stomach. That acid in the stomach actually starts to break down these macromolecules into individual, let's say, poly, mono, and ultimately saccharides, and ultimately individual sugars. In the context of protein could actually, upon ingestion, some of those amino acids might be converted to sugar, but also can cause a glucagon response, which also releases sugar. So all these foods have different degrees of glycemic impact. And the reason we're focusing on glycemia here for a second is because ultimately the magnitude of glucose response to that meal, there's supposed to be, in a healthy normal scenario, a dose-dependent response on the amount of insulin that's going to be released from the beta cells of the pancreas. And so the higher that glucose level, these beta cells have this fine-tuned machinery that detects elevations in glucose in the beta cells and releases a dose-dependent and appropriate amount of insulin to handle that glucose response. But what we know over time is that in the context of type 2 diabetes, where someone is probably becoming more obese, they start developing signs of things like prediabetes. They probably don't know. 80% of people who have prediabetes don't know it. And they start developing this dysglycemia. Well, what's actually happening when this dysglycemia is starting to emerge is these subtle signs of insulin resistance early on. And ultimately, when that glucose is released from these pre-stored granules from the beta cells into the hepatic portal vein, that insulin usually goes straight to the liver. A huge chunk of that insulin is eaten up by the liver, and glucose is brought into the liver to be stored as glycogen, in case you were in a famine or running away from a dinosaur, historically speaking, right? To ultimately release that glucose in times of stress or in times of low glucose environments to maintain blood glucose homeostasis in the 70 to 120 normal glycemic range. But as glucose gets higher and higher, insulin is released more and more, and then it starts to store it in other tissues, such as the muscle tissue. And as your body develops things like increased adiposity, inflammation being a part of that, you start to develop things like insulin resistance. The insulin stops working as well. You start needing more insulin to compensate for the insulin not working as well at the receptor level. And actually the excess insulin in the periphery starts to then also develop things like insulin resistance. And that's actually what we see in the context of a disease like type 1 diabetes, where patients lose complete beta cell function or almost complete beta cell function. They have to start taking exogenous insulin. And when they take exogenous insulin, because it goes predominantly to the periphery at higher levels than someone who doesn't have exogenous insulin or doesn't have to take it in the peripheral tissue, they also develop insulin resistance. So this is a very similar model of why excess insulin in the periphery causes insulin resistance. But all the way back to your original question, one of the fundamental reasons someone develops insulin resistance for most people is because they develop excess adiposity. That's one of the mechanisms by which can lead to things like inflammation, and things like inflammation are tightly linked with things like more and more resistance to insulin. So it's not the only thing that's going on, of course. It's many complex things are happening in biology, and no thing seems to happen in isolation. But that certainly seems to be an important component to the story.
Does muscle size versus function dictate the ability for it to be a glucose sink? And what I mean by that is, obviously, muscle is trending for metabolic health, right? Yeah. Everywhere you turn, you hear it. Like, build more muscle, it's a metabolic sink. Yes, okay. But there's also a lot of people that don't necessarily want to put on a lot of muscle. And I can't help but wonder, is like, healthy muscle tissue that has healthy mitochondria. Like, what is more important, having more sheer mass that can be a sink for more glucose, or better metabolic health, mitochondrial health of that muscle tissue?
So after today's video, our sponsor is Seed. I put a link down below for 25% off their daily symbiotic. So it's a probiotic and a prebiotic in one. So it has a really unique delivery system. So I am a fan of probiotics when you're making a change to like your diet or a lifestyle, because it can kind of help remodel that gut microbiome to help you make that shift a little bit sooner. Now, full disclaimer, they're a sponsor on this channel. That's how this channel works. It's how we're able to create amazing content. But my promise is that I only recommend products that I personally have used or currently use. So Seed down below, that is a 25% off discount link, again, for their daily symbiotic. I would probably guess that you'd notice a difference within about a week of taking it. Start noticing it digestively, you might start noticing it in other ways. But for me, I got more energy, I started sleeping better, things just seemed more regulated. So anyhow, that link down below, 25% off.
That's a great question. I'm actually going to simplify that or dumb it down even a bit more and say the most important thing is that someone actually engages in physical activity. There is so much evidence that if someone just engages in meaningful, purposeful physical activity, obviously being physically active in a daily setting where you're standing up and moving around, that's obviously great, very important. We know that, let's say, doing like 8 to 10,000 steps has all this metabolic health benefits. But purposeful exercise, someone showing up at the gym, I'm purposely working very hard. Moderate to vigorous physical activity is incredibly important for acute insulin sensitivity. And we know that the benefits of exercise obviously have long-term impact, but there's a lot of evidence that suggests, especially in the context of something like type 2 diabetes, where there is notorious insulin resistance. I mean, that's what characterizes this disease, that it's a short benefit, meaning that you have to keep it up. So if you do an acute exercise bout, that can immediately induce insulin sensitivity, reduce insulin resistance, and you can maintain that benefit for hours, sometimes days, maybe a couple days, but you have to do it again. You have to maintain a regular exercise pattern, routine. And that is probably the most important thing, not so much the size of the muscle, not so much the function of the muscles, but that you're actively engaging it on a regular basis to induce a lot of the sensitivity to insulin, the glucose uptake into those tissues, more than, let's say, size, more than, let's say, function in and of itself. So if someone wanted to take an actual step and say, I want to improve my overall metabolic health, reduce my insulin resistance, maybe my glycemic control, showing up to the gym, being purposeful with your exercise routine is frankly one of the most powerful things you can do right here, right now to improve your insulin sensitivity. That is well known. But that also tells us a little bit more of an answer to your more nuanced question. And that seems to be that engaging that muscle and utilizing it and keeping it active and all the things that come along with it. You mentioned the mitochondria, there's so many mechanisms underlying that clearly seem to be important for facilitating this insulin sensitivity. So yes, I think there's importance to your question, but a general theme for people to take home and actually actionably walk away with today they can go do is go engage in physical activity, because that is the one thing that reliably increases insulin sensitivity right now.
Yeah, I think there's a I don't want to say it's a misconception, but I think sometimes an overemphasis on sheer muscle mass.
Yeah.
Where it's, once I have this muscle mass, like I have this magical sink that's going to just collect my glucose. And I do think that that's true to a certain degree, but that muscle in motion is what matters more than anything. And it's, you can be a brick house bodybuilder and have, but if you're dormant, it's not really doing that much for you. And it burns a couple additional calories per day too. It's nothing crazy, but when it's in motion, it's an entirely different ball game.
And Tom, to that point, think about this. Someone with that type of muscle, you mentioned the bodybuilder phenotype, right? There's no way they're maintaining that level of muscle mass without being highly physically active, engaging in probably huge volumes of physical activity. So one usually is happening with the other. Very few people are sitting around like we're sitting here today. We did exercise today and we engaged in a lot of things that would be beneficial for everything we're talking about: insulin sensitivity, glucose control, all those things. But those people, who have huge muscle mass, they're not sitting around on their butt all the time. They're usually doing quite a lot to maintain that. So you're kind of getting 2 for 1 there. You can't really have that without having the other. Yeah. And so, yeah.
Why do you think there is such I don't want to say a demonization of sugar, right? I mean, you and I both come from probably similar camps that we've been in terms of like our viewpoints. I know you and I have both kind of been in the low carb space, and we've both been in and out of it, and we both have looked at that. We're both big into fasting. We both kind of, we look at metabolic health probably through a very similar lens. Why is it, and where did it come from, that there's such a massive demonization of carbohydrates? Because even as someone that's still a low carb person, I still am low carb on the grand scheme of things, but I'm not anti-carbohydrate. So where did this come from, and where can we give a thoughtful acknowledgement to the fact that, hey, like maybe they're not wrong, but some of this has just been blown out of proportion in different ways?
I think that comes because we know that there's a lot of scenarios where excess carbohydrates leading to excess blood glucose causes all these detrimental acute and chronic complications. And most notorious of that is in the context of diabetes. And we know that in those contexts, that if you reduce carbohydrates, it has this oftentimes very potent therapeutic response. And so the easy thing to jump to is that, well, obviously sugar might be causing that effect. It's in and of the same as how the story on type 2 diabetes has occurred, where we know that you can improve type 2 diabetes and or obesity by being physically active and improving your nutrition. But actually, we know the story is much more complex than that, and how someone may get there. It doesn't mean that because you didn't do those things, you got type 2 diabetes or obesity. It just means that those are beneficial tools. So then people jump to the other side of the coin. Well, is obviously, if you have type 2 diabetes, you're physically inactive and you must be having a poor diet. Oftentimes that is the case, but it's not always the case, and it doesn't mean it's the cause. And I think that's often how this story has occurred, in that we know that in athletic context, carbohydrates can reliably, in the literature, so let's just stay away from any, conversation, and we can stay very evidence-based and data-driven and just say, in the literature, we know that carbohydrates are important for things like performance. Are they essential? No, that's a whole different conversation. We've done a lot of research in the lab actually looking at that conversation. And there's a lot to unfold into that category. But I do think that because reducing carbohydrates has such a potential powerful response in contexts where dysglycemia, in the context of insulin resistance, are present, that people look at it being sugar in the context of carbohydrates, because sugar comes from carbohydrates. That is a problem, and that it must be the cause of the problem. And certainly if you change it, you can improve outcomes in many of these scenarios. But it doesn't mean that in all scenarios, in all contexts, it's bad.
That makes a lot of sense. And if you look at, we were talking offline a little bit, and you've held this close to your chest for this conversation, but you're type 1 diabetic.
Yep.
A lot of these discussions surrounding glucose, you mentioned something, it was interesting. They kind of stem from what we experience in a type 1 diabetic realm, right? Yep. You see these things as in isolation. I'll let you kind of describe that. You've got a phenotype that's generally pretty healthy. And then the only difference is the fact that they don't produce insulin, right? So all of a sudden you see, so I'll let you kind of describe that, because what do you see in the lab from a type 1 diabetic standpoint, and how that translates into the discussions that we have in the mainstream?
Yeah, you mentioned I have type 1. I've had type 1 for 17 years now, and I have played around a lot with different dietary strategies, to your question before. In the context of type 1 diabetes, for those who aren't familiar with this is this very unique phenotype we can learn quite a lot about. As you mentioned, the average patient with type 1 diabetes is usually normal or low body weight. At least historically speaking, that was the case. For a lot of reasons, they're actually looking a lot more like the general population, but that's a different discussion. But historically speaking, they were normal body weight. They don't have excess adiposity levels. They don't have excess lipids. They don't have all these things that happen in type 2 diabetes. They just lose the function of their beta cells, which produce insulin and regulate blood glucose. And you can think about this as almost like a thermostat. Your beta cells almost acts like a thermostat for glycemic control in the body. And your body keeps this really tight glycemic control, 70 to 120 milligrams per deciliter, very, very tight. That's essential for maintaining overall health. If you go too low, you can, on the extreme end, die. You go too high, it can cause these chronic complications. So in type 1 diabetes, we've learned that these often very normal, perceivably very healthy individuals, they just lose their ability to normally regulate glucose levels. So most patients live not in this tight range, but this very high and variable glucose levels all day, every day. And what we see is we're able to largely isolate out the impact of glycemia on acute and chronic complications. And one of the first things we see in this context is when you see these high and variable glucose levels without all these other negative metabolic health problems, that this can lead to very early signs of microvascular complications. That means retinopathy, the small vasculature in the eye, nephropathy, the small vasculature in the kidneys. It can damage your nerves. These are very vulnerable tissues to high glucose level. A lot of people use this analogy. It's a lot like sandpaper to these small vasculature. And that's definitely true. People with type 1, because of their high and variable glucose levels, can have much higher complications of microvascular disease. But in the context of macrovascular disease, is what most people think about when they think of cardiovascular or blood vessels like based diseases. And we see that patients with type 1 diabetes who are largely normal, but just have these high invariable glucose levels, have 10-fold higher risk for cardiovascular disease. And so it's actually the number one cause of death in type 1 diabetes. What that tells us is that glucose plays a very, very important role in the context of obviously microvascular disease, but also macrovascular disease. In fact, when we look at some of the largest studies ever conducted over 30 years, over 1,000 patients with type 1 diabetes, we see that the number one modifiable risk factor for reducing or increasing the risk of macrovascular, again, heart disease, vascular disease, is glycemic control in the context of a biomarker called HbA1c, hemoglobin A1c, which is this average of your glucose over a 2 to 3 month period of time. And so we can learn a tremendous amount on the impact of glucose to tissue-based organ health, macrovascular complications, and also cardiovascular disease when looking at this very unique phenotype.
Question, not to pivot too much, but with your HbA1c, if someone has a normally healthy person, not type 1, not type 2, but they are stressed a lot and active a lot, can that influence their HbA1c, or is there like a natural sort of barometer that kind of, or I shouldn't say barometer, is there sort of a natural thermostat with that wouldn't affect the HbA1c? Or if you're looking at HbA1c, is that a very clear indicator that this is, hey, no, this is almost entirely metabolic?
HbA1c, because it's a chronic capture of the amount of glucose that sticks to the red blood cell, HbA1c has largely been viewed as this biomarker that as more glucose sits around in your blood, so this tight range of glucose as in your vasculature, as more glucose is sitting in that blood, it will stick to tissues. So it's very sticky. So it'll stick to tissues like HbA1 or your hemoglobin, but also sticks to other tissues like your tendons, ligaments, other tissues. In fact, that's actually why, if you've ever seen an analogy for people, if you've ever seen a caramelized onion, before you take an onion, you actually cook it. Before you cook it, it's this white color, and you cook it, it starts to turn brown. Well, that's actually a lot of the same pathways and it tastes sweeter, right? That's actually because of similar processes in the body to someone, let's say with type 2 diabetes. There's some evidence that people with type 2 diabetes, you actually look at cadavers, you can actually see almost a browning of their ligaments and tendons. And it's largely believed to be due to the sticking of glucose to tissues. But there's a lot of reasons why HbA1c that influence HbA1c. So why would something stick to a red blood cell more or less, or tissue more or less? Well, obviously having more of it around is the most strongest predictor of glucose sticking to a tissue like a red blood cell, and then you measure your HbA1c and it's higher. So that's the most important factor. But we also know variable levels of glucose. So having these big spikes in glucose, let's say you just down an old school Coca-Cola or Pepsi or something like that, and you do that every single day, that very variable peak and trough and valley, the higher that variability also is a predictor of higher HbA1c. And there's a few other variables that play into that, but HbA1c is a hard and fast, strong predictor of chronic glucose exposure in the blood, and with a pretty reliable predictive value for that, north of 70%. But it's not 100%. And the reason it's not 100% is because it's a biological process of a glucose molecule sticking to a tissue, was its own process in and of itself. It's not just total glucose exposure. There's a process that is leading to that stickiness. That isn't the same for me and you, Tom, or say someone else, right? So there's always individual variability in that, but those are the key variables in chronic glucose exposure. Is the most important of all those, and why HbA1c would be higher. So if someone is stressed on a regular basis and they see their HbA1c go higher and higher, that is probably a pretty good predictor that they're seeing higher and more variable glucose levels in their daily life, which would often not be a good thing. You wouldn't expect it. Higher and higher glucose levels is a good thing. In fact, most of the data to date says that as you see higher and higher levels of glucose in an average person, that this is predictive of things like all-cause mortality and cardiovascular disease, early mortality, and all these things. And this is a very predictive dose response. So so glucose has important impact in our overall health. It's very clear that that's the case. We've learned a lot of that predominantly historically from patients with type 1 diabetes, where it's the main thing that goes wrong, and everything else seems to be pretty good, if not a really healthy phenotype. And as a result, we can learn how and why glucose might be very important for people.
What about in the case of a metabolically healthy person that is a level of peripheral insulin resistance as a result of, let's say, low carb fasting? I mean, it can happen, right? It's I noticed my HbA1c was actually higher on a low carb diet than it is not on a low carb diet.
Interesting.
And I would have my fasting glucose was significantly higher on a low carb diet. Whereas obviously I am a healthy, active person. Whereas in a lot of people that go on, say, a low carb diet that are overweight, they see an improvement, right? And I know I'm not the only one that's experienced that. I went up to a 5.4, which is not high, but 5.7 being the outer range before you kind of start looking at things. I was up as high as a 5.4 with all my other biomarkers looking great. Yeah. And the only thing that was different was, okay, that was a very, very low carb diet. And you would think, okay, well, that would modulate your glucose. But generally speaking, my glucose was higher. So can you explain sort of the difference between pathological insulin resistance and peripheral insulin resistance in that case? Because people hear peripheral insulin resistance or, my blood sugar's higher when I go low carb or when I'm fasting or anything like that. What's happening there specifically? Like, is it a preservation thing? Is it a...
Yeah, so pathological versus this physiological insulin resistance. So pathological insulin resistance is this resistance at the receptor to insulin, often due to, let's say, excess adiposity, inflammation, excess insulin floating around the blood because it's not working as well in the context of type 2 diabetes, typically associated with obesity, and it doesn't work as well, doesn't bring in glucose into these large glucose sinks like muscle. But in physiologic insulin resistance, this is a term often given to when someone may be normal healthy and they go onto a low carbohydrate diet and they notice that when they consume things like carbohydrates, they don't seem to have, or maybe a higher oral glucose tolerance test, or this appears to illustrate this insulin resistance. Because if you take glucose and you need more insulin, or glucose goes higher, there must be insulin resistance going on. This is a very complex scenario. So once your body starts adapting to utilizing fat, we've done a number of studies in the lab looking at total body carb and fat oxidation. And when you go on a long-term ketogenic diet, go through the multi-week adaptation period, which we have done many studies like this, where we see someone come into the lab, they go onto a very low carbohydrate diet, they go through this multi-week metabolic adaptation, ultimately reach what we think is, this metabolic homeostatic stage, typically around 4 weeks for a normal glycemic person. Let's say you continue on that pathway. We assess these individuals at this time point, right? After they've done this diet, they see this change in metabolism. What is that change? That change is, if you look at whole body metabolite oxidation or fuel oxidation, you see lower carbohydrate oxidation and higher fat oxidation. So if you were to dump a bunch of glucose in your system, do something like an oral glucose tolerance test, would you use as much of it? No, because you've shifted your fuel use towards things like fat. So you're not per se so much resistant, but you have shifted your body's machinery to be better at what you were giving it. In this context, fat. And all of a sudden, when you reintroduce something that it's not using on a regular basis, like sugar, you may be less inclined to oxidize it as quickly. It doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It's just someone chose that dietary strategy for a purpose, and they've shifted their metabolism, and your body gets good at utilizing what it has. So when we think about insulin resistance in a physiologic context, it's always in the backdrop of these standard carbohydrate diets. And so it's a different conversation when we start talking about low carb, because you are changing so much about your metabolism that the same rules don't always apply. And there's a lot less research on what it means to be low carb and have this physiologic insulin resistance. Is it even insulin resistant? These are open-ended questions that aren't really answered. But what a lot of people jump to immediately is, well, if I have carbohydrates, my glucose might go higher, or my HbA1c might be climbing up a little bit. And there's so much under that hood that may be explaining that we don't fully understand. And so what often people might want to do when they think about this is, why'd you do it? Do you feel better? did it move most of your health metrics in the right direction? And that probably was a good decision for you. But if everything's static and all of a sudden you just have these much higher, more variable glucose levels, maybe it's time to reevaluate what you were doing, because if the only one thing got worse and everything else stayed the same, that's not a good trade-off. But in the context of, say, like I have type 1 diabetes, and we know that there's a lot of emergent evidence from our research team looking at these low carbohydrate-based strategies and how powerful they can be for a patient on that journey. But we know that low carbohydrate diets may not be the end all be all, may not be optimal for everyone, and everyone has to kind of go their own path, figure out what works for them, and ultimately find a strategy that optimizes their own health.
So if we flip that whole situation on its head, though, like we've got, physiologic insulin resistance, which is the body preferentially utilizing fats and glucose, therefore going higher. If you take someone that's the opposite, that's primarily a carb oxidizer, and they're eating the standard American diet, does that mean that they have a surplus of fatty acids circulating? And don't those theoretically, not even theoretically, in reality, store significantly easier? They don't have to go through de novo lipogenesis and go through the process that excess glucose does. So if someone is a poor fat oxidizer and much more geared towards carb oxidation, and sounds like I'm leading this up for a specific answer, but I'm genuinely curious. Like, does that mean that when they were to eat a mixed meal, their body's going to take in most of those carbohydrates and oxidize them because it's a preferential fuel source, and then it's going to leave them with free fatty acids? And don't those have to go somewhere?
Yeah, they have to go somewhere. They're usually not just being dumped out of your system. So it harkens back to some of the early parts of this conversation where on a standard dietary strategy, okay, meaning not low carb, these 45 to 65% carbohydrates, again, this 15 to 25% fat and or lipids. On a dietary strategy like that, there are a ton of experiments that have been done where you do lipid infusion on that dietary backdrop, that foundation, that environment of a high carbohydrate-based diet that most people are consuming. And you infuse lipids. We know that that's one of the most reliable physiologic environments to induce insulin resistance. And so it's actually a model of insulin resistance to infuse fatty acids on the backdrop of a high carb diet to induce insulin resistance. So to your original question, having higher fat levels or shifting from what is a standard diet to a standard American diet, which frankly, what that means is you're lowering a little bit of carbs, but you're upping the fat. You're predominantly upping the fat in this environment. Would it cause insulin resistance? Yes, it does. Yeah. And the largest or the one strong belief as to why that actually is from these lipid infusion experiments where high levels of fat lead to insulin resistance in that context, which is why fat has been looked at least in part, why fat has been looked at as such a bad thing for people. But again, most of the evidence looking at our understanding of lipids and its role in overall health and carbs and fat and all these other contexts has largely been in experimental designs where someone is high carb. We have done so many experiments with athletes, patients with diabetes on these different dietary strategies. And the physiology of high carb is the physiology of low carb are completely different things. And we know a lot less about the physiology of low carb on the acute sense, but definitely on the chronic sense. And so there's a lot to be learned there, but we do know some core principles. And that one, metabolism fundamentally changes. You shift your fuel demands towards fat and lower on carbohydrates. It typically means less insulin, although not always. And you are shifting a lot of your metabolism towards just a fat dominant metabolism. And over here, you're carb dominant. And when on your high carb diet, you add more fat, can you cause more insulin resistance? Yeah. I mean, that's all the evidence seems to point that is in fact the case. Over here, it's a high fat diet, and is a high fat diet inherently insulin resistant? No, it's not. For a lot of people, it actually reduces the amount of insulin and ultimately biomarkers of insulin resistance for these people. So these are two different scenarios that have to be looked at in not simple context, but in a more complex, nuanced way, that these are different physiologies from one of the most potent stimulus of changing metabolism, which is nutrition. Nutrition is one of the most powerful ways to shift our metabolism. We know this and have known this for a long period of time, oftentimes more than any medication can replicate. And so yes, to answer your question, we know that fat seems to induce insulin resistance to a number of well-done experimental physiology environments, but a lot of that's on a high-carb diet. So we have to contextualize it in that context.
Without getting too far into the weeds, I mean, you're a good person to ask this. The Randall cycle. I mean, is that something in general, independent of being in a surplus, mixtures of high fat and high carb? And again, surplus, I'm going to asterisk this because I always get hung up on this. Define a surplus. Is it in the moment? Is it over 24 hours? Is it over 7 days? It's so hard, like if I eat 2 peanuts right now, technically for a nanosecond, I'm in a surplus, right? I mean, I don't know. So it's difficult to answer, but is the Randall cycle something that people should at least be on their radar? Or is it something that is so, and you can describe what it is, but I mean, I'm genuinely curious because I've always found from a fat loss perspective, I can speak from my own, that when I tend to go through phases of either, if I'm higher carb, I'm typically lower fat. And I know that's just a displacement thing too, but I also am conscious of that. And if I'm higher fat, I am lower carb. I just don't respond well from a body composition standpoint or cognitively when I'm like high on both.
And actually, that's a very important point to address first, is that this middle ground, and so you can kind of look at this as the spectrum, right? So over here, you have these high carb, low fat diets that have been promoted for many years to be very health promoting. And then on the other end of this, there's all this emergent evidence that these ketogenic diets can have all these health benefits in various contexts. But we have to largely look at these on two ends of the spectrum, right? You have high carb, low fat. Over here, you have very low carb, high fat. They both seem to produce some pretty powerful health benefits. The second you start mixing both of them at high levels in this Western diet, I mean, that is what a Western diet is. It doesn't go well almost ever, Maybe the only scenario where it seems to be seemingly okay, so to speak, is in very high volume athletes who do a ton of physical activity, who are essentially almost pushing as much into their system as they can to maintain caloric needs for the physical activity. That's a very unique scenario. 99% of people do not apply for this. And so, that's a whole different conversation, how people should not look at literature on like the elite athletes and say, you should do this, because elite athlete is its own phenotype, okay, its own scenario. But most of the benefits we see are on these two ends of the spectrum. And so it's just on a big picture level, we see that just loading the system with more fat and or carbs simultaneously doesn't seem to go very well. Your body seems to do very well when you are on one end of the spectrum. So high levels of fat and high levels of carb, it seems that usually on the context of a high carb diet, you start adding more fat, more insulin resistance, higher glucose levels over time. Over here, you're on a low carb diet, you have very low carbs, you start reintroducing carbs, things don't also go well, as we were talking about this physiological insulin resistance. You add more carbohydrates to someone who's reduced their carbohydrate oxidation, you're going to lead to higher and higher glucose levels in the blood. So those are scenarios where that's not ideal, where you add. It's not ideal to kind of take from these two ends of the spectrum where it seems like there's a lot of health benefits and start shifting closer towards the center. And that is a Western diet. And we know that a Western diet is an obesogenic diet. Beyond just the physiology of the body seemingly have a harder time when these are both high, oftentimes eating a dietary paradigm like that is also obesogenic. So people tend to overeat those diets. Yeah. And that obviously can lead to adiposity, insulin resistance, and all the metabolic soliloquy that comes along with that, which is often not good.
Yeah. No, that's a very interesting way to look at it. Because I mean, I think way back when it was like even like Charles Poliquin had talked about that, right? His theory behind it was flawed in the sense that, like, I think he used to talk about how insulin would essentially allow fat into storage, which is not exactly how it works specifically, but I mean, his concept of it back in the day, it made a lot of sense to a lot of people, right? And you coming from somewhat of a bodybuilding background, I think you probably can appreciate some of his principles made some sense, even though some of them seemed like they were pulled out of thin air. But it was also, it just seems, and even from an athletic perspective, like looking at that, it's like, okay, like, yeah, you could probably influence a certain level of metabolic flexibility sheerly just by the volume of training and the type of training that you do. But that can also be accelerated by sort of this nutritional catalyst. And when you look at like okay, well, if I need to get fat adapted, sure, I can do that by doing lots of endurance work. But it's an accelerator to obviously deprive myself of carbohydrates and get myself there faster. So I'm looking at these, I'm like, okay, if these are big levers that we want to pull for optimal performance in different avenues, it would make sense that you're like blunting some of that by standing in the way of it, right? So like, why would I, if I was hypothetical, why would I, if I was training for maximum endurance?
Yeah.
Like, why would I want to muddy the water with both substrates when I could really just pick one and double down on that? It seems like it'd be counterproductive absent of the fact that I would probably just have a high caloric demand. And the most important thing at that rate is probably being adequately fueled.
So it's interesting because a lot of the exercise physiology mindset was the opposite of that, which was push as many calories into the system as possible from diverse sources so that all of them can be used simultaneously to give as much fuel substrate to the tissues as possible. This is also why back in the 1970s, there was a ton of research on MCTs, because the idea is we know that medium chain triglycerides, when consumed, rapidly convert to ketone bodies. So if we can push glucose, we can push fat, we can push ketones, get every substrate we can in there to utilize as many of these metabolic pathways to push as much HEP out so that you can utilize it during exercise. So that was actually the philosophy for a long period of time. It's also the same philosophy by why a lot of people who consume these very high carbohydrate-based fuels and do it intermittently during exercise, like long duration prolonged exercise, will often use multiple types of glucose or things that will ultimately convert to blood glucose because it can use different transporters, push as much into the system. So that's actually a common theme in exercise physiology. Get as much in that system so you have as much available fuel substrate. But it's a totally different scenario outside of exercise where what you're talking about is what's peak performance? What can we do to achieve peak performance and push as many fuels in the system? It is so important, and people often don't talk about this, that the average person does not fit in that category.
For sure.
Okay. And so should not be taking that type of philosophy towards their overall metabolic health more than do whatever you want, right? Do whatever you want. But logic dictates that if you start doing what an elite athlete does and pushing all the calories into the system as much as you can, outside and during exercise, probably not a good move for you. But the average person, it seems like, the idea of finding a nutritional strategy that not only complements something you can comply with and fits with your life, but also allows you to hit some of the key pillars of health, right? Can it help you maintain normal body weight? Can it help you not feel ravenously hungry all the time? For a lot of people, low carb or getting away from highly palatable carbohydrates is life-changing to them. So they're not constantly feeling like they need to feed all the time. And so that person might do really well on a low carb diet. And then, some people who are more prone to, let's say, having high fat, and they notice that they may flip into this physiologic insulin resistance. Maybe that, we don't know completely. Maybe that is or isn't a good thing. We don't know. At least I would argue we don't completely understand if that's a good or a bad thing in this context. If someone were to go up within the normal range of HbA1c by doing low carb, but it's still normal, does it really matter? It's all very complex and not completely answered. But most people can tell when they go on a dietary strategy if they're feeling better, if they're sleeping better, if they feel more physically active, they don't feel more lethargic. And I think many people are going to lose their mind when I say something like this, but I don't think everyone should be on the same diet. And I think that goes back and harkens back to a number of factors: genetic. What have you been doing? What lifestyle do you have that leads you to be more successful in one strategy or another? I have type 1 diabetes. And so these two diets are not the same thing for me. A high carb diet versus a low carb diet are like sea of difference between the impact it will have on my overall health. So, disease context also matters. And then maybe also the type of activity you do may have an impact. We've done a lot of research recently looking at high-level athletes and their ability to utilize high carb versus low carb and or ketogenic diets and its performance or metabolic, but also subsequent performance impact on these very short duration, high intensity exercise, but also these very prolonged exercise bouts. And I think what comes out of that tells us a lot. But in a general theme, you have to find what works for you. And if it works, or try it, right? And if a lot of times in science, there's this bar graph, right, that you're looking at in these publications. And you're like, okay, that study says this. But what often people lose is in that bar graph is 10 different dots that fit above and below that line. What if you're the dot way up here, or you're the dot way down here? Maybe you should be doing something different than the person way up here. And what these studies often tell us is what is the best idea? What is science telling us on average in these individuals in which it was studied? But it may not tell you how Tom should optimize his life, or Andrew should optimize his life, because maybe Tom is this guy way up here and Andrew might be down here, or maybe the opposite, And so you have to consider that and try it and see if it works.
That's solid, man. Well, Dr. Koutnik, where can everyone find you, man?
So honored to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you guys on Twitter at @Koutnik, AKOUTNIK. I'm also a researcher at Samsung Diabetes Research Institute, so you can check samsung.org out for a lot of the research we're doing on the context of people at risk or who have diabetes. And I am on Instagram, although a total novice. I don't really, I just put things out randomly. It's Andrew Koutnik, PhD. And I do have a website, andrewkoutnik.com, where I try to put out free information and materials for people who have or are at risk for diabetes, and maybe some strategies they might have to utilize or have resources available to them.
Right on. Well, thanks for being here, brother.
Honor.
Thanks, man.